welcome to the second webinar on entry points for mainstreaming ecosystem-based adaptation. My name is Andrea Bender and I'm working for the BMU ICI-funded global project on mainstreaming EBA implemented by GIZ. So before we dive into the topic, I would like to give you some technical remarks. This webinar will be recorded and published on adaptationcommunity.net. And for those of you who would not like to be recorded through the chat box function with their names, I would kindly ask you to leave the room. You can watch the webinar afterwards online on adaptationcommunity.net. You are all muted as participants, but please feel free to actively join the webinar by using the chat box function on the left-hand side. And if you have technical problems, please send us your email address so we will try to help you further. We organized this series of webinars for the international EBA community of practice, and while the first webinar on entry points for EBA focused on the case of Peru and South Africa, we will have a closer look today on the case of the Philippines. So first of all, I would like to welcome Thora Amend. She will provide a general introduction on entry points for mainstreaming EBA, and she will share briefly the findings from Mexico and Viet Nam. Then we will hear experience from the Philippines by Emma Ruth Ramos. Afterwards, you will be able to raise questions and we can discuss. At the end, we will conclude with some next steps. So now I would like to ask you, Thora, to unmute yourself, and a very warm welcome to you.
Well, thank you very much, Andrea. This is Thora Amend speaking, and thank you very much to everyone for being with us here today to share some of the results of the entry point study and governance analysis of EBA that we did for GIZ. So here we have the agenda, which Andrea already mentioned briefly, 2 blocks with Emma Ruth presenting on the Philippines more in detail, and I will be giving you the overhead of the general study and Mexico, Vietnam, and with that, then we complete the 5 countries that we worked in together with the first webinar highlighting South Africa and Peru. So what is EBA? EBA, as we all know, this is just a small element again of a reminder. It helps people to adapt by using nature, and it is part of an overall adaptation strategy to climate change. So it is a people-centric concept that acknowledges that human resilience depends on the integrity of ecosystems. And as such, it is part of an overall strategy that is called nature-based solutions, not only to climate change, but also to other challenges. Mainstreaming, our task when looking into entry points for mainstreaming, we first of all have to think about what does mainstreaming mean and what do we want to achieve by that. Well, obviously we want to integrate adaptation objectives and nature-based solutions into strategies, policies, and all kinds of operations and projects. So to make sure that EBA becomes a coherent part of development strategies and policies, and that it becomes, in the ideal case, part of the overall budgets allocated. By that, we want to enhance effectiveness, efficiency, and the long-term impacts of a strategy. And obviously, the overall goal is to increase the resilience of people and ecosystems to the changing climatic conditions. Now, if we look at in the context of our assignment of entry points, we try to somehow come forward with a visualization that makes it clear what is it that we have in mind. And during the first webinar, Matthias already presented this slide that we have developed, where we try to show that we have different sectors and sectoral policies, and they all include EBA at different levels. We talk about the impact level, we talk about indicators, formulations, and we want to look into the instruments and methods that have been developed in every sector in order to make sure that EBA is somehow mainstreamed into that. So the overall goal, as said, is to enhance livelihoods in the face of climate-related risks. So this mainstreaming target has been published in the context recently, in the context of the Convention of Biological Diversity, in the paper, the guidance developed for disaster risk reduction together with climate change adaptation. So EBR and ECODRR are at the focus of that paper. Already mentioned last webinar with Matthias is in a slightly different form, but the context is the same. We thought about diversity of governance. One of the findings that was very clear in the 5 countries that we did the assessment was we are still at the beginning. Usually when we ask people, interview partners there, on their EBA or potentially mainstreaming activities of EBA, the answers related to state agencies. So that is a very important message that we want to share with you, that governance of EBA really has to go beyond the state. Everyone is impacted by climate change. So we also have to understand that this is a shared task, and we really should make every effort to invite other actors in. Not only because the task is so big that the state alone or government agencies alone couldn't possibly cope with the immense task, but also because we think that private sector or civil society groups offer a big potential for innovation, for broad thinking, for making it coherent, and to enhance the long-term impacts of our strategies, the effectiveness and the efficiency. So all of that that I mentioned when I had the second slide on mainstreaming of EBA. Having said that, there are specific challenges related to governance in the context of EBA that we have to keep in mind, and GIZ with the global program on EBA is just only starting to dive deeper into governance issues. This is a new field, and I think I can speak on behalf of GIZ there and the colleagues there that everyone is invited to share their experiences, their points of view, and join the discussions and the development of strategies with regards to governance of EBA. Challenges include that we talk about multi-level governance. It's from local to national to international levels. We talk about different levels that usually have different powers when we look into vertical dimensions of governance. We also look into multi-sectoral governance. So that is across sectors. How can we make it coherent, the interventions on EBA there? But we also want to bring in the private sector in more active ways, creating opportunities for private sector, for business, for companies to join forces there with the state and the civil society actors to make this coherent. And a third, but very challenging aspect of governance is that we are dealing with high uncertainty. We don't know exactly what kind of tipping points will be reached when, what are the direct impacts of climate change in a given region or in a given sector. So we are dealing with the high complexity and high uncertainty there. And we can only try to orient our approaches in flexible ways so that we can detect opportunities and adapt the strategies according to the upcoming constellations there, while keeping in mind the long-term strategy and intention of reducing the impacts of climate change on communities and different sectors. So for that, we have applied the so-called EbA Governance Matrix, which we developed. This is inspired, some of you might have been working with protected areas, and IUCN, International Union for Nature Conservation, has developed a matrix showing that we have 4 different big columns of actors out there who we can share the responsibility with. The column A, is governance by government. So most of the initiatives that we've come across during the assessment are state agencies. They can be on different levels, on national level down to municipal or local levels. On column B, we focus on shared governance. So if different actors come together, that can be, we've also grouped in this group the donors, external agents, like UNDP or UNEP initiated the flagship EbA, so-called flagship EbA projects in the high mountains area. They have been initiated by external agents, but are being carried out under what we would call a shared governance scheme there, together with the government agencies, state agencies there. We can also have the group of private governance, private actors there. And these actors can have different motivations. That can be a think tank or university with non-commercial interests, but it can also be an actor, and we'll see that in the case of Mexico, where there are commercial interests behind, but the motivation is to reduce the risks for the investment of a company there by using EbA. And then the last column, column D, is we can have indigenous peoples or community governance. So the motivated actors for doing something, for carrying out EbA, are local communities, be that indigenous or whichever other local community, taking in their hands the EbA initiative. What we analyzed in the context of entry points, without diving too deeply into that, is we started by analyzing what are the climate change signals that have been perceived by the different actors, and then what are their specific motivations? Why did they want to promote, why did they opt for going for nature-based solutions, specifically EbA? Then we want to analyze, obviously connected to that, who are the key stakeholders, the main actors, who drives the process of EbA mainstreaming. And there then, who are pioneers or champions? We heard in the last webinar on South Africa, for example, they talk a lot about champions. In other countries, they speak of pioneers. And then who are the followers? We need champions in the countries there to drive action. And then the later on followers there. But important especially in the context of governance, is how does the coordination between them work? What is the governance structure of EBA in the given countries? What have been enabling factors? What are barriers or hindering actions? And how were solutions found with regards to mainstreaming of EBA? One of the factors that we encountered as a major hindering factor in the different countries is communicational aspects. And that starts with, we repeatedly heard the comment that the term EBA, Ecosystem-based Adaptation, to many seems to be very hard to communicate to non-technical people. So one of the suggestions that we came across in every country was, why not opt calling it, when communicating to outsiders, as natural solutions? So the bigger family there, because that is easier to understand and does not require major explications. Then when we talk amongst ourselves, obviously we can use the abbreviation EBA or Ecosystem-based Adaptation to make it very clear and make the distinctions to other family members of the natural solution group. We also analyzed and tried to understand what were the key messages. How do people convey, or sectors convey to others, convincing them that mainstreaming EBA is important? What have been lessons learned, and what are recommendations for further mainstreaming EBA? We analyzed the momentum of change. So three streams: the problem stream, who perceives what as a problem with regards to climate change, what proposals and solutions exist, and is there a political will to act? Do people have mandates? How are election terms, for example, or where is the power to change policies as we know them? So we want to analyze the windows of opportunity to influence decision-making and support change. And it's important to understand that these windows of opportunity can occur at all levels of governance. So it's not only on the national level. With this, we come to the 5 partner countries there. We see Mexico, Peru, South Africa, Vietnam, and the Philippines. 4 of the analyzed countries are so-called mega-diverse countries, which have, they are one of 17 countries worldwide. All 17 are in dark green color here. And the 4 yellowish are mega-diverse countries. The only one is Vietnam, not being classified as a mega-diverse country with regards to biodiversity. All 5 have serious challenges with regard to climate change impacts. Now we'll move into Mexico. The entry points for mainstreaming EBA in Mexico. We analyzed 3 examples in Mexico, which I will briefly present. The challenges with regards to climate change are very high. Especially affected is the sector of agriculture there, since the food production conditions will worsen for the majority of crops, and that makes it challenging for the sector there. Obviously related to that is the water sector, the increasing droughts, and we have the changing precipitation patterns there, and the sea level rise on the coasts with saline intrusion that affects the water resources and the agricultural sector there. We have increased storms and severe or extreme weather events that can have or that are expected to have great impact. Here the case studies, they have been diverse and distributed over the country. The first one is the Grandes Islas region that focused on integrated landscape management. It has fisheries, it's important for fisheries and is highly biodiverse. And it focused on intersectoral planning processes, resulting in several institutions that have worked with EBA measures. And there we had the interesting case where the state governor mandated participation, and that relates somehow to the lessons learned that it is important for us to understand the barriers for engagement. We need to define the scope of the process and relate that somehow to, so the scale of the dimension of planning is very important. Who is related to a planning process? What are the potential implications there? EBA needs to be based, not only EBA, but in our context, EBA needs to acknowledge and incorporate the stakeholders' interests and needs. So trust building is very important, and promoting of engagement of the different actors when we have in mind mainstreaming of EBA. We need to engage with the different decision makers and working level officials on the different levels to ensure the follow-up actions there. And obviously staff and resources, financial and human resources, are very important to keep in mind when we design, especially the big landscape scale interventions, that we keep in mind that the resources need to be secured and kept in mind there. We need to monitor and communicate the results and incorporate the landscape scale planning into all of the different sector policies and operating documents. So this is a very big scale planning. And as said in many occasions, also in the last webinar, landscape scale interventions is where EBA measures work best at, but they have their implications. It makes it highly complex. The second case study was the Gulf of Mexico. There we focused on risk reduction. As we heard, the risks in Mexico are related to sea level rise, and that affects coastal wetland management. There, the lesson learned is really a major one on we need to combine and think together EBA, ecosystem-based adaptation, together with disaster risk reduction measures. So try and integrate those elements. And again, think about funding for long-term planning and the governance. The bottom-top governance is important. In the case of the third case study there, we had a very interesting example of private sector engagement, the restoration of coral reefs to prevent beach erosion. So there the setup was the private sector, the hotel owners, tourism sector was interested in maintaining the beaches, that the beaches being very important asset for tourism. So they had the beaches insured, and the insurance company was very interested in reducing the risk of beach erosion. And by pulling in the Nature Conservancy, in this case, as NGO, to ensure that the management of the coral reefs are being done in such a way that the erosion of the beaches does not carry on and have the devastating impacts. They set up an EBA scheme. This is still being developed or fine-tuned, but there are very interesting lessons learned involving the private sector. So with this, we come to the second country, Vietnam. In Vietnam, the study is much broader, but I would like to highlight the Mekong Delta situation. The Mekong Delta is subsiding due to groundwater extraction and sea level rise. And there we see that the situation becomes very challenging, is quite dramatic, because this is the region where food for especially rice crops for several million people are being produced. Here we see that the Mekong is highly vulnerable, and that relates, and I picked that one as an example because it gives us another aspect for EBA entry point for mainstreaming. Here the challenge is basically related to grey infrastructure. The dam building, it's a highly engineered environment, especially in the upper reaches of the Mekong. We see that that has led to the silt no longer is deposited downstream in the traditional ways, and accordingly the rice cultivation was changed, and now partially the GIZ projects and other donors come back to traditional rice cultivation, floating rice paddies, for example, in order to enhance their the adaptability or the overall subsistence of the rice cultivation in the Mekong Delta. So what is urgently needed in Vietnam or in the Mekong region is to develop coherent and integrated action plans for all 13 provinces located in the Delta region. There we see that the window of opportunity, again, relating it to the 3 streams model that we had earlier on and in the first webinar as well, presented by Matthias, is that we see a great opportunity in the Mekong Delta. And I would like to highlight that briefly. So in the case of the Mekong, we have a high public awareness now that the delta subsides while the sea level rises. So people are aware of the problem across sectors, including civil society, including private sector. We also have the second stream there. We have solutions in place. EBA concepts have been developed a long time ago. Initiatives have been implemented. Experiences have been generated since more than 10 years. And with the third stream, the political stream, we see that there is a will to act now, and the actors have the political power. Governments, provincial administrations, communities, international donors, all of them are pushing plans to change business as usual, or as it has been in the past decades in the Mekong Delta. And a very important window of opportunity, which is a momentum for policy change, cropped up in September 2017 during the Mekong River Conference, where the Prime Minister of Vietnam breaks the ground for EBA when he said that we want to go away from the highly engineered solutions and rather open up for nature-based solutions, specifically ecosystem-based adaptation measures in the Delta. So we see that many things are in place in Vietnam already. Data is available, vulnerabilities have been analyzed, the policy frameworks are there, awareness and capacity is there. Nevertheless, up to now, the tremendous challenges remain unsolved. And what is urgently needed, as I pointed out, is a comprehensive plan for adaptation involving all 13 provinces of the Delta. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thora. So, dear participants, if you already have questions regarding this part, please feel free to type them into the chat box on the left-hand side. Now I would like to hand over to Emma Ruth Ramos. Very warm welcome, and please unmute your microphone. We will hear from you potential entry points for EBA in the Philippines.
Okay, hello everyone. Good afternoon from the Philippines. This is Emma Ruth Ramos, the freelance consultant who's based in the Philippines, who together with Thora and Andrea made the case for the Philippines on mainstreaming ADA.
Shall I take over the slides? Or is it
Yeah,
working?
sure.
Okay.
It's not loading in my
I will do
laptop.
so. Just let me know
Okay.
when to change slides.
All right.
Okay, it should work now.
Okay. Maybe just an introduction on our study in the Philippines. So the Philippines is quite advanced in terms of policies and frameworks on climate change adaptation and mitigation. But of course, the more important thing to consider is the implementation of these policies and frameworks. So basically, the study was implemented in September to October 2017, so that's almost a year ago. And it's quite a really fast appreciation of what is happening in the Philippines in terms of EBA and the potential entry points in terms of governance in the Philippines. So, is my slide working, Andrea?
Do you already see the slide? Exposure to climate change in the Philippines?
It's still loading, but okay, I just can go on. So, in terms of exposure to climate change, the Philippines is actually a very vulnerable country in terms of climate change. So, the risk factors include sea level rise, extreme rainfall events, extreme heating events, increased ocean temperatures, disturbed water budget. This is based on a study conducted by the Department of Environment and Natural Resources in 2013. So in terms of, next slide, in terms of EBA relevant policy framework, as I said earlier, we are quite advanced in terms of policies and frameworks. If we look at the relevant policy and frameworks of the Philippines, it is embedded, EBA is already embedded in the Philippine Development Plan. The Philippine Development Plan is the mother of all plans for our country. So it basically, Chapter 20 basically talks about ensuring ecological integrity and improve the socioeconomic conditions of communities, as well as for the Climate Change Action Plan, or what we call NCCAP, which is being updated now, includes ecosystems for enhanced resilience and stability of natural systems and communities. Other plans and more on the sectoral plans is the Philippine Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, which was published in 2015 until, well, it is valid until 2028, states that biodiversity should be effectively managed to maintain ecosystem services to sustain healthy, resilient communities. And more on the planning side of the Philippine government is on the comprehensive land use planning guidelines, which was crafted and launched in 2013-2014, which adopts the RIG or Integrated Watershed Ecosystems Management Framework. And lastly, on a smaller scale at the sectoral level also is the Sustainable Integrated Area Development Program of the government. So it talks about area-based interventions, concepts on its natural resources development programs. So next slide is just the framework for which the country implements climate change adaptation and mitigation. The National Framework Strategy on Climate Change is the country's roadmap in creating a climate risk resilient Philippines. Next slide, Andrea. So the National Framework Strategy on Climate Change is the country's roadmap in creating a climate risk resilient Philippines with the general goal of building the country's adaptive capacity and increasing the resilience of natural ecosystems to climate change, optimizing mitigation opportunities. So next slide on the relevant policy framework for EBA. The NSFCC includes a lot of provisions introducing EBA in the climate change scene of the Philippines. So the framework envisions a climate risk resilient Philippines, and with the goal to build the adaptive capacity of the communities and increase the resilience of natural ecosystems to climate change and optimize mitigation. So there are a lot of opportunities at a higher policy and framework level for the Philippines. Next slide on the governance.
Do you already see the governance slide with the stakeholder map for EbA Mainstreaming?
Not yet.
I think it should be visible for the participants, hopefully.
Okay, but it's there. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Sorry.
For the governance, this shows the stakeholder map for EbA Mainstreaming in the Philippines. So basically, this figure illustrates the different stakeholders that currently and potentially play a role in mainstreaming EbA, as identified by the Community of Practice in late 2017. So the Community of Practice is an informal mechanism that holds great potential for expanding the network, not just to EbA practitioners, but also to the wider public, and can eventually influence key stakeholders. So basically, this illustrates the different stakeholders and their potential or existing roles in mainstreaming EbA. So this includes government agencies as well as other governance structures, other potential partners for EbA. So this also includes stakeholders, which includes NGOs, non-government organizations, the business sector, and finance sectors, experts, and development partners. So next slide. During our study, we have identified promising entry points for EbA mainstreaming. So basically we have 5. First one is the land use planning process. Second one is the Sustainable Integrated Area Development Strategy. And third one is the Climate Change Adaptation and Disaster Risk Agenda. Fourth one is the Protected Area Management. And the last one is the National Climate Change Adaptation Plan updating, along with the National Adaptation Planning process. So we will look briefly into each of the entry points. So the first one is on the land use planning process. So as I've mentioned, we are a bit advanced in terms of setting guidelines, policies, and frameworks, incorporating climate change, adaptation, and mitigation in our policies. So the first one is actually being done by the land use planning is being done by the municipalities and cities at the local level, but it is being the implementation of the guidelines is being spearheaded by the Housing and Land Use Regulatory Board. So there are various actors in this process because we, as part of the team who actually advocated for this one, which was also GIZ funded, includes a lot of actors, not just at the natural resources sector, but also at different planning realms. So basically, the land use planning process has included ridge to reef approach and the watershed management as a core planning as a core in terms of planning for the local level. So what we have included here is that the mainstreaming of EBA should be included in the updating of the forest land use planning and local community climate change adaptation plan at the local level, which will eventually be integrated in the comprehensive land use plan of the municipality or city. So there are two concrete opportunities. One is to identify possible targets for mainstreaming EBA in the planning and updating process of the risk assessment module of the HLURB. And the second one is for local governments in terms of updating their comprehensive land use plan. So the second entry point for EBA, so next slide, is the Sustainable Integrated Area Development Strategy. So basically the SIAD, as we call it, was mentioned in the Philippine Development Plan of the concrete actions to really integrate climate change adaptation and mitigation and in the natural resources sector. So the main actor in this entry point is the DNR, or Department of Environment and Natural Resources, and the contributing actors are, well, it depends on the type of project or program that the SIAD can address. So the mainstreaming or the entry point for this is it can link local plans with the existing national plan and programs of the government. So one concrete opportunity is for the DNR to revisit the SIAD strategy, which includes targets and should already document lessons on EBA. So the next one is for the entry point 3, is the climate change adaptation and disaster risk agenda. So this is more on the higher policy level discussions. So this is basically driven by the DNR with contributing actors from the Cabinet Cluster on Climate Change Adaptation, Mitigation, and Disaster Risk Reduction, including the Climate Change Commission. So on the mainstreaming side, EBA prioritization and inclusion in the Climate Change Cluster on Adaptation and Mitigation Disaster Risk Reduction Roadmap. So there, last year, it was already being discussed, but I am not sure with any of the updates for this one. But including EBA in the discussions of the roadmap and really putting it in the document will really mainstream EBA, not just a project or a program, but really integrate it into the whole process of the government plan and program. So a concrete opportunity is to promote nature-based solutions for climate risk and adaptation needs, starting with the articulation of the need for the national agencies and subnational levels to conduct strategic environmental assessments on resilience as basis in policy formulation and future programs decides. The next one is for entry point 4, protected area management. So this is again under the DNR Biodiversity Management Bureau. It was already part of the Philippine Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan to include not really the term EBA, but ecosystems and climate change adaptation, as well as resilience to climate change impacts. That it should already be included in this strategy and action plan. So to operationalize the EBA content of the Philippine Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, you have to really include specific action points for each of the Bureau of the DNR, as well as other relevant actors. So the document on protected area management initiatives are already related to EBA, and we can use this as part of also to link EBA and OECM or other effective area-based management, area-based conservation measures. So the last one is on the National Climate Change Adaptation Plan updating and the National Adaptation Planning process. So this is initiated by the Climate Change Commission, and I think the process is still ongoing. And there is high hopes for EBA to be really included in this one, because there are a lot of champions really advocating for EBA in this updating of the NCCAP. So we hope that EBA can be one concrete strategy in updating of the NCCAP, the National Climate Change Adaptation Plan, and to really link climate change adaptation and protected area management as EBA contribution to the plan. So as Thora discussed earlier, we have also looked into the motivations for mainstreaming EBA. So next slide on the motivation. So this is based on the interviews and that we had last year, as well as some discussions during the workshops. That in terms of the three, they have really put into, and really very relevant, that the most common motivation for them is the awareness of the problem. So in terms of the problem stream, they said that EBA can contribute to reduce the vulnerability to climate change. EBA provides a series of co-benefits, strengthening the arguments for EBA. EBA is an efficient and effective approach, as well as CSOs and academia can guide policymakers in the design and implementation. In terms of proposals, it's more on the technical side, but they have included finance and incentive mechanism, forest management, and mechanism to strengthen livelihoods, more on the sustainable forest management, framework to link disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation and mitigation. And the last one on the political stream is on the implementation of the Philippine Development Plan, as well as the implementation of the Paris Agreement and the Comprehensive Land Use Planning Guidelines. So just quickly on the diversity of governance, which Thora also presented earlier. So on the diversity of governance, it depends on how, or it depends really on the participants' perception on how they initiated or be included in terms of mainstreaming EBA. So this one, it's based on the interviews and some of our discussions, but it just means that EBA can be initiated, or mainstreaming of EBA can really be initiated and be followed up, but by everyone who's really part of the whole governance, whole of the governance. So next one is on the barriers and challenges. So we have identified 4 chunks. So the first one is on the technical issues, more on the lack of data, more on the valuation of ecosystem services, and quality of plans, as well as motivations of stakeholders. More on the institutional side is more on the interagency cooperation, implementation, and clarification of mandates in terms of who really is part of the governance arena. So the last two are more on the legal and policy, although this one is not really at the, as I said, we are more advanced in terms of legal and policy, but there are still a lot of clarifications that need to be done. So some examples are on tenure, property rights, ownership, and conflict of intended use of resources. The last one is on awareness, although this one, it depends on, of course, on the area and on the stakeholders that we talk to. So more on the lack of buy-in for local government units, weak knowledge and awareness, and lack of political will. So just in passing for the opportunities for EBA, one is the harmonization of valuation tools for environmental services, political prioritization of projects and programs in EBA, linking EBA and REDD+, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, and the role of conservation, sustainable management of forests, and enhancement of forest carbon stocks. Next is on the linking of EBA and the People Survival Fund. It's the and also the implementation of framework of EBA. So lessons for mainstreaming EBA, since the Philippines has a lot of lessons from natural resources management, climate change adaptation, and other implementation of projects. There, we have identified 4: technical, policy, and legal, cooperation, and awareness. These 4 areas are a bit general, but this should already be clarified and advocated by not just the the main actors, but also the stakeholders. So next is on the economic and fiscal incentives, which are already existing and can already be, well, some can still be tapped for EBA. First one is on the PAS, Payments for Ecosystem Services, PSF, Public-Private Partnership, Resource-Based Livelihoods, Tax Incentives, and Risk Insurance, which can all, I think there is a new PC project for this one. So next one is financing EBA. There are a lot of financing mechanisms that are already available for, at least this one for the government side, not just at the national government level, but also at the local cities and municipalities. So one example is for the DNR, since on the third key result area of the DNR, or the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, it already includes integrity of the environment and climate change adaptation and mitigation. This can already be funded by the national government, which I think SIAD is part of. So, and the last one is on the cooperation mechanisms. So there are a lot of cooperation mechanisms already existing in the Philippines, and EBA can just be introduced at any level of these cooperation mechanisms. Although one of the what we have mentioned earlier is the community of practice on EBA, which has really done a lot in terms of promoting awareness on EBA mainstreaming. And this can just produce a lot of people who can advocate for EBA, not just at the government level, but at the local level. So next, this is my last slide. So this was the workshop on EBA evaluation last year, where we really get to have their inputs from the different sectors, different stakeholders, which are very much into EBA mainstreaming. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma Ruth. So we now have around 10 to 15 minutes for questions. This session might take a few minutes longer, sorry for that. So please use the chat box function on the left-hand side for your questions. And I might already show you on Adaptation Community Net, we do have the 4 country studies online already. You can access them all on adaptationcommunity.net under publications. Okay, so still waiting a little bit so you can type in your questions. Okay, I see as there are no questions so far. You can always contact me via email and also Thora and Emma Ruth. I thank you very much. Okay, thank you for your comments from Armin Jensen. Okay, if there are no further questions, I would like to conclude this session now. As I said, you can find the studies online, and the recordings of this webinar will be online soon on Adaptation Community Net. I see there's a question. Thank you very much. So there's a question. Can we also access cost effectiveness and economic benefit study reports on the same site? So I guess this question goes to both of you, Thora and Emma Ruth. During your studies, have you come across cost effectiveness and economic benefit study reports? What we have published at the Global Project for Mainstreaming EBA is the Valuing the Impacts, Costs and Benefits of EBA. This is a guideline how to value the costs, benefits and impacts of EBA measures. Attached to it, there are 40 case studies from all over the world using very different approaches on how to measure these effects. I will briefly send you the link in the chat box as well. Thora, would you like to add something to it?
As you have mentioned, and the last slide, the photo that Emma Ruth presented showed the workshop that we did in the Philippines with Lucy Emerton, and that was exactly on EBA valuation. And as you just pointed out, it would be helpful for the participants to maybe include the link here briefly to the study, analyzing the 40 case studies there. With regards to the comments that we came across in the different countries, yes, it is a very important aspect, much sought information to prove the cost effectiveness and the economic benefits related to EBA as compared to other measures, to grey infrastructure building, etc. To me, very personally, one of the learning experiences cropped up in Durban in South Africa, because we all communicate that EBA is very cost effective as compared to grey infrastructure building. And there was one comment that convinced me that was interesting. From Deborah Robertson in Durban, and she said, stop talking about cost effectiveness of EBA in the urban sector. It is not, because it requires great extensions of land, and land is what is most valuable in, or very valuable at least, in an urban context. So while we do understand that EBA measures can be very cost effective, especially in the rural regions, I think it is valuable to make that distinction and to keep in mind when we relate to others, to politicians or other sectors there. In the urban context, the setting is different. So don't just simply repeat an argument without having the proof for it. That would be my insight on that one.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have another question to you, Thora. With the example you shared earlier, would you call the EBA in a landscape dealing with various levels of governance transformative adaptation?
Well, it can be. Yes, definitely. It depends on how you carry it out. When we talk about transformation, we keep in mind long-term change in the perspectives there. So yes, definitely it can have that element. It depends on how you do it. So as with many other or all of the projects and programs that we work in, it depends on the quality. How do you do it? What is the strategic vision of that? And how do you implement it, the quality of the implementation?
Andrea, I also have some inputs in terms of the cost effectiveness of EBA.
Yes, sure.
Although, yeah, because I was also recently part of the team for the New Clark City in Tarlac. So it's a new city which they claim to be the new city for government agencies. And we have, as part of ADB, Asian Development Bank, we have advocated not really the term EBA, but we have advocated conservation of the river that's included in the city. And we have made a study pointing out that protecting the river or not really putting infrastructures on the river will yield more benefits to the future city. The New Clark City, I can also share it to you guys, although it's not GIZ funded, but it's interesting enough really advocate to government agencies, especially for the developer of the New Clark City, to really protect the river and use the function of the ecosystem as a leverage in terms of having future developments, specifically for the New Clark City.
Thank you. I have another question to you. Given that mandates are split between several departments and local governments, and given further that, for example, the Department of Public Works are implementing highly unsustainable non-ecosystem-based approaches, and the country has no restoration authority, but a mandated reclamation authority, who do you see as the most effective driver for the proposed way forward options? Maybe in the case of the Philippines, what do you think?
Yeah. Because also I cited in the paper that we have is that since the Philippines is really pushing for the build program, it's really now at the balls on the hands of the DPWH, the Public Works and Highways, as well as the Business Conversions Development Authority, which is also into really developing. So as part of their partners before, what's really they are open to really including EBA in their development plans. But what's important is for them to understand what's in it for them. So I guess, for example, again, sorry if I go back to the New Clark City, we pointed out that the Climate Change Commission it also committed to have its own office in the New Clark City, should have a say on how to really drive development in that area. So if we really broaden, for example, the role of Climate Change Commission or DNR for that matter, we can really influence these developers or these government agencies to really switch on the greener side of development.
Switching to the greener side of development, there's another comment to you, Thora, on cost effectiveness in urban areas. It seems that other ways to integrate EBA is needed for the urban context that are cost effective. It's more of a comment than a question, but if you have some ideas to add up on, please feel free to do so.
Well, yes, maybe, and trying to round off a little bit our webinar here. My main message would be to be very to try and understand the motivations of the different actors there. There is no blueprint. So we can't really maintain that idea of I have the authority, being the state or being an organization. Look into the different constellations, into the different motivations, into the different times there and opportunities for mainstreaming and for pulling different actors in that might have an interest in talking to you as a state agency, for example, on why are they motivated in the urban area or in any other context to look into nature-based solutions. So as we saw in the example from Mexico, it was the private sector that we came across that that element there for the coral reef protection in order to protect their beaches. In the urban sector or in any other sector, you will find people or sectors interested in pushing something, and then try and understand the momentum of change. Those windows of opportunity that we so much insist on in our study, those are very short moments. So be prepared, keep your eyes and ears open and try to seize the moment of policy change. And then be prepared with your proposals, solutions, the players and networks, and try and keep in mind the long-term effectiveness and the long-term impacts of the projects there when starting an initiative. Looking at the moment, seizing the moment to step in with nature-based solutions and trying to develop the long-term perspective of climate change and resilience enhancing.
Okay, thank you very much for all your questions and comments and answers as well. I would like to conclude this session now. As I said already, you can find the study online on Adaptation Community Net, and the recordings of this webinar will be online soon as well. I would like to invite you now to short feedback regarding this webinar. You can find the link within the chat box, and I promise it will be only a 5-second survey. So I highly appreciate your participation. Thank you very much, and we will keep you updated regarding future webinars. Have a good day. Bye-bye.